All right. Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Emmanuel, and I work at the University of Copenhagen. I originally come from India, and I will primarily talk about Indian cities today. And it's a perfect segue from what Michele and Luca presented earlier today. Why are we talking about pandemics so seriously today? Is it because at our doorstep? But this has been happening continuously for many years, decades across the world. When the COVID-19 pandemic started, it took us by surprise, at least in media, when we looked at images of millions of people stranded or walking across to reach homes because they were either going to be quarantined because they didn't have their daily work anymore. In that context, I wrote a poem when we started off, and I'll start with that. Walking through the virus, I left my home, my people, my land, searching for a ray of hope, a light through the tunnel. I fled poverty and marginalization. I fled looking for hope. I made a bed in a slum, as they call. I shared the shower with a million others. I shared my space with 10 others. Space? Yes, just a 15 square meters and a loft with another few men. Under the sheets of tin we cooked, we ate and we worked. Fires and floods, who cared? The virus came, they care. Not about me, but that the virus might come into their own home. They told me to stay home. They called it social distancing. They get paid for that, but I don't. And if we all stayed home in the slum, how do we distance? Clean water. I never saw that before. How do I wash my hands for 20 seconds without water? I don't get to eat because I have to stay home. What do? Walk home no matter the distance. It was a few hundred kilometers I succeeded, no matter the heat. I collapsed once. Some water came, then some food. Thank you, Good Samaritan. Then came barricades to stop me, the migrant. Then came the sanitizers for the buses, but they sprayed them on me. Then came the canes, the police's parade of power asking me, why am I walking? Because I cannot work from home. And if I don't work, I don't eat. They closed the borders, and the sight of my real home is gone. Even if I had the virus, nobody cares because I've left the city. No water, no soap, no distancing. Unemployed, unpaid, and starved. The poverty, my darkest fear that I fled, I see it come again. But I walk home, long walk home. That's the plight of most of our cities filled with migrant populations. When we look at disasters today, when we look at, if we use disaster as a prism to study inequality in society, it's a perfect sort of a lens because it reveals layers of inequality in society. When we talk about disasters, we're looking at why disasters happen and what's the relationship to the Sustainable Development Goals or the new urban agenda that everybody is talking about. If we look at the new urban agenda, which came out in 2016, it basically came up creating this new vision for new cities across the world. However, what some of us are talking about is that this was always in the happening. This was a process that Michele was talking about, that this risk that has been created in cities has been going on for decades, if not more. Which is where I want to start off by saying, when we talk about floods, earthquakes, any kind of disaster, there's always a nature blame. We always call them natural disasters. It's very common with international organizations. It's very common with scientists, with media, that we continue to use the term natural disasters. However, what a lot of us who work in this space believe and have written a lot about is the fact that there are only natural hazards. There are no natural disasters. Because disasters are always a process in the making. It is the fact that there is vulnerability in the equation, that is what causes disasters. It's not the hazard in itself. In a healthcare context, for example, this extends to the way we're looking at vulnerable populations who are worst affected, and how can everyone have access to healthcare in some of these settings. If we look at a slum in Bombay, or if we look at the favelas in Brazil we're talking about very, very small square meters that many people live within. And if we're talking about quarantining or isolating in those spaces, it's going to have other repercussions. The majority of these people living in informal settlements are daily wage laborers. They move from either fleeing from their rural areas. Today, we're also seeing this fleeing could be because of the climate distress. What does that mean when they have to go back to their city? To their own homes? Do they have a livelihood? If they have to work, working from home is not really an option for many of these people. I think we've forgotten this as part of sort of the COVID-19 story. Primarily, when we look at disasters, when we look at disaster risk reduction, health is one aspect that has received very little attention. And one of the reasons why is the fact that we've always been responding to disasters. We've only looked at disaster management as a process of response. We've not looked at it as a long-term preparedness, as a long-term resilience building exercise that Michele spoke about. Even if that was the case, it was, for example, was what Luca was referring to. People would talk about it only when there was a certain amount of power, or if it affected the powerful in some sense, right? However, disaster risk reduction then needs to be seen in the light of addressing these complex mechanisms, right? These complex systems. It's not one sector that gets affected. It's a multiple layers of different sectors that get affected. Therefore, why is it important to revision or redesign our urban spaces? Why is this important? And I'll refer this to our experience of talking about memories. For some reason, all our lessons learned with regard to disasters and pandemics seem to be forgotten very often, very quickly. And I'll refer to 3 important points here in this regard. Disaster memories and memories with previous pandemics, it helps us to reflect on inequities in society, inequities and inequalities in society. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted that in many societies, layers of social inequities, we continually need to ask who is the most at risk. And I think the pandemic has revealed these inequities. These memories play a very important ground for learning. Pandemics and disasters such as the COVID-19 have shown us how governments can enact swiftly and provide ample opportunity for policy planning and response. Why doesn't this happen when there is a disaster, when there is no disaster response, that is in a normal developmental context? Coming from India, we saw that some of the states that responded better were the ones that had invested in public healthcare systems during normal times. Not the ones that were built during the pandemic. And this is a learning because memories provide an opportunity to look into the future with hope for change. I am with Michele and Luca on this, that right now, there is a momentum. There is a momentum for change. And as with previous disasters, the pandemic provides an opportunity for governments and policymakers to move into the future with key policy changes, with key operational changes. How do we re-envision our cities? How do we redesign these cities? While the architect will be busy talking about space, while the architects will also be talking about the relationship of COVID-19 to the built environment, it's extremely important not to forget that there's a sociological context to all of this. That what Michele ended with, in the fact that these are built on years of inequality. These cities are built on power struggles. What happened in places like Singapore, Mumbai, many other places? We've forgotten that millions of invisible citizens, that's the migrants who've built these cities, who were never even taken as part of the city in the urban planning process, for example. where do we go from here? And that's a difficult one. And I think that while we redesign our built environment, we need to redesign our social protection mechanisms. Places that have been drastically affected, some of our urban cities, we've seen that it's the failure or the lack of social protection mechanisms. And these need to come back into place right now. It's the urgent need of the hour. We need a substantial understanding, a disaggregated understanding of what does risk and vulnerability mean in these contexts. Why do people affected the way they do when a disaster or a pandemic strikes? What do we need is we need a risk-informed development. We need to move away from creating more risk in our cities. We have empirical evidence to show that urban disasters are going to be here, are going to stay. They're not new. However, why do we continue to only respond to disasters and stop creating disaster risk? And finally, what we need is to be able to move in this direction. We need to keep this momentum if we want to achieve the sustainable development goals. We want to move towards new urbanity. We need to be discussing this with a long-term vision, because 2050 is not very far away. And there's a clear relationship between the COVID-19 pandemic, disasters, the sustainable development goals. Let's not forget that while the COVID-19 pandemic is happening, the climate crisis hasn't stopped. There are many countries in the world that face the COVID-19 pandemic along with other multiple hazards. There are floods happening. There are millions of people who are displaced due to floods at the same time. How do you social distance, cyclone shelter? That means that your capacities have to be doubled. We're talking about multiple layers of complexities and interconnectedness. And we cannot do this alone. We need a multi-scalar, multi-risk approach to be able to address pandemics and disasters. I think I'll stop here for now, and we'll open up the floor for questions and comments.
Thanks for the great presentation, Emmanuel. Now we have our guest speaker as well, Lisa, also Director of Innovation from Gale. So thank you very much for coming on Chart. I give the floor to you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for being here.
Of course. Thank you for inviting us. So, hi, everyone. Thanks for waiting and being patient with us. So I'm from Gale, a company that has, we've been doing research within cities for people, or how to create cities for people for 50 years. And Gale started with releasing a book in 1971 that is called Life Between the Buildings. And since that, Gale has been working very specialized with how we can actually create better cities for everyone, that is inclusive, that for everyone, and that is comfortable and healthy. So during this COVID crisis, we have been out doing a lot of surveying. We do public life survey, where we go out and we actually see what's happening, if there's a behavioral change, if people are acting another way than they usually do, if they're moving different, if they're together with people or not, if they're alone out or not. So today I'm going to talk about some of these results from COVID and try to reflect on how these can actually help qualify the way we plan our health-proofed cities in the future. And to us, we had a question many times about, is COVID temporary changing the cities, or is it a permanent change of cities? I think we would like to not discuss that, but more talk about it has changed behavior in cities for a very long time, or even maybe permanently. We have all changed in COVID. But it's a crisis, just like there has been other crises. So before, we have talked about how do we terror-proof a city. We have talked about what about climate proofing. We have been talking about proofing cities in a lot of ways. And now we want to move over and say, what's a health-safe city? When do people feel safe? And is that social safety? Is it health safe? What kind of things do we need to think about for creating a resilient city in the future? So I'm hoping to get you some insight about that. So I'm starting with, but actually zooming out. We have been looking at a lot of cities around the world. Just at the moment, we're looking at Tel Aviv, Lima, Tirana, Recife. So we're right now out actually, or having people help us from the different communities to do this research. But one of the things we are looking very much about is this kind of insight that no matter how the behavior has changed, it's very affected by that our way of working or going to school have changed. So looking at the tendency that, well, right now you can see on the curve, we went from being here just before the pandemic, 100% of companies working from home. And within a week, we fell down to about 20%. So in the States right now, and you can see how it continues, we're over here now, it's still down on 25% the way we use office space. And this makes us think very much about like, well, we will work different in the future, and it will impact our future of work, both physically, which we are very interested in, but also behavioral and also emotional, like the way we don't meet our colleagues every day. So we are talking very much about what does this mean for our community and what does it mean for the future of office space. We're talking very much, is there a need for a fourth space that is different than home, work, cafe? We've heard about hubs before, but are hubs safe anymore? What is a hub? And I think this is one of the things that we work very much on now, that should there be something out in the local neighborhood, should there be a place where you could go to actually meet when working. So this is a huge tendency that of course have changed also the way office space is being used. So how do we make sure to design for this in the future? Another insight is that during the lockdown, it was very interesting to see this local meeting places, they actually thrived really much. We were out doing this surveys in 4 cities in Denmark, especially very much in Horsens and in Svendborg, Helsingør and Copenhagen. And we were going very much deep dive. And it was interesting to see that people have really much used their local neighborhoods more than ever. Actually, when we have interviewed people, over 60% have said that they have actually found things in their local neighborhood they had no idea was there. And people have had a tendency to actually feel like staying in their local neighborhood much more. And in another way, they haven't had the need to leave the neighborhood, which is a very big change in tendency, because before, especially in the big cities, you moved very much more across the cities than you do now. This could obviously go together with people don't wanting to take public transportation, for example, because of being too close to other people. But it could also be, as I said, that people actually found some other positive sides of the local neighborhoods that they weren't aware of before. So what you see here is Sundby Østerplads on Amager, for example, where you can see a very big redistribution of age groups too. So what we saw was that there was a lot of more kids out, which for me could go together with there are a lot of children being homeschooled. It's not super surprising that there were more. But what was interesting for us is that when we look through all the data we have collected in Copenhagen over almost 50 years, we have never seen so many elderly people over 60, 70 that actually were using the space much more than ever before, which is of course interesting when looking about that this was the most supposed sensitive group, that they were actually going out using public space. So this has been super interesting for us. And when we then have also looked at the reopening phase, it's interesting to see how it's even more kids. So it's hard for you to say, I think, but when you see the after here, the dark, there's so many more kids out now after, but the elderly people have actually pulled back again. So they're not using public space as much in the reopening. So when we want to talk about inclusion in public space, and we talk about gender, people with different cultural background, and age groups, this is very, very important data for us. Because if you see that actually an age group, elderly people are actually afraid of going out when the reopening happen, for me, that's a sign that that's not a health secure city for everyone. So now we're looking into why are they not going out, or is there specific places they go out than we were guessing they would go out. So So we think that people will spend more time in their local neighborhood, making amenities and destinations there more important. So again, going back to this kind of, should we have more working places in the local neighborhood? But also, should we actually plan better to move out some activities to the neighborhood, make it very interesting local places or meeting places for people instead of inviting to the city center? So another thing is also how I may ensure that everyone has access to recreational green spaces close to their home. This was also a challenge we saw, that if you look at the city center in Copenhagen, around Strøget and Gammeltorv, there's no green spaces within half a kilometers. There's no green spaces at all for people to go to. If you look again at Amager, Sundby, Østertorv, there's 12 within the same, as 12 different pocket parks. So it's not enormous parks at all, but just the fact that there are a lot of pocket parks is actually inviting people to get out and have access to green space. And again, coming back to equality, coming back to inclusion, this is one of the things that we think is really important in the future when talking about a place for everyone. Everyone should have access to green open spaces, because that's where we get out, get exercise, get air. And in a urban place, this is so necessary and has been so needed in this crisis. So I mentioned before a bit of the city center, and I want to go back to that. So we had a huge decreased activity during lockdown. We had a 80% decrease of people during lockdown in Strøget. There was a lot of, in the whole city center, in Horsens, we had 96% of decreased activity in the city center during lockdown. And you could say, well, that's because the shops were closed, the commercial activities were closed. But that's exactly the point here. Is that a resilient city center for you? Because for us, it's not a resilient center. It's not a place where there's a lot of different activities for people. So you might look to, well, is that interesting when you see at the same time that activities actually went up in the local neighborhoods? And that's the kind of questions we think is very important to ask here. So how might city centers attract more dynamic work, culture, and productive activities? So how can we actually go back to how city center used to be 100 years ago? 100 years ago, there was production in the city. You can go in and you could have your clothes to, you could do a lot of things. But where are those things today? And could we actually change the way we talk about rents? Like, how can we actually make room for other people to be in the city center? And where's the municipality in this? And what about public buildings? Could we actually move some public activities like kindergarten or things that actually creates life and that actually makes a city center be more resilient and more alive, dynamic, because that's also a part of feeling safe where people are. So we are looking very much at this, like culture is so important, because if you have a cultural plan or like some kind of plan for it or a strategy, you will still have things happening in the city center. And that was, for example, what we saw in Svendborg and Helsingør during lockdown. They actually had a lot of great initiatives. They were like going out, having a lot of like gatherings on a distance, and they actually continued a lot of their cultural activities, even though the shops were closed. And that actually changed that the activities were higher in Svendborg and Helsingør. So again, instead of just going there to have a really expensive cup of coffee, which is starting to get, I had like a coffee for 49 the other day, and I was like, this is crazy. I'm going to bring my thermos next time. I think it's crazy that you have to spend so much money to be allowed to be in a city center. So I think this is like, how can we actually start to think in another way? And how can we be more circular around this and like create more like hubs for changing things or delivering things? Like, how can we think about new services in the city center? And how can maybe private stakeholders go together across that have never thought about working together? So another thing we were looking at, and I think I mentioned it short with transportation. This has been quite wild to see how people's behavior have really changed, both lockdown and after lockdown. So you could see that on the left here, we have how many do you following form of transportation more or less after lockdown. We don't have really much on the more side. We have a lot of on the less side. This is, we have asked 3,000 people. So it's quite many people that are saying we use metro much less, train, bus, taxi, e-scooters, all of this they're using less. Bike, it's about the same, but walking has really increased, which is a really good news. The bad news for us is down here. People are driving much, much more than they've done before. This is kind of a hard news for Copenhagen and Realdania, for example, that actually were a part of this collaboration, that how do we actually change this direction we're going in, because this is increasing slowly. So, and when you look again, this is like the ownership of private car, it's increasing a lot. And yeah, you can see we're here in July 2020. I don't have the newest numbers here, I can see, but it's actually going up again. So people are buying more and more and more cars. And again, going together with media, going together with that public transportation can be a bit complex when having masks and so on. Of course, this effect that I rather take my car because I feel safe. So this kind of safety, feeling of safety with transportation is super, super, super important. And I would say that the one thing we really see as a challenge is if the car ownership continues the way it does, it's going to increase like how the networks will be paralyzed. The networks in Copenhagen are not built for that. I mean, if we continue letting the car ownership grow, our roads will be filled with traffic instead of going the other way, where if people were not driving as much, we could use that space to create traffic or to create more space for people to be there. Green space, open space, like I just mentioned, is really important. So this is kind of a critical fact for us. And I would also say, like, this is actually one of the things that we are very interested in. We talk very much with Metroselskapet and with Arriva, Movia, like how can we actually try to move, like how can we create more safe or healthy public transportation again, despite the conditions we're in? Like the masks haven't changed that much, a bit, but how can we actually get people back to public transportation is really important. And I just read the other week that they're expecting 1 million e-cars to get into Copenhagen, which is a good news because it's e-cars, it's electricity cars, so it's not the bad ones polluting, but it doesn't change that it's going to be 1 million more physical cars in the city center. So for us, this is super important to say, well, it's not about creating infrastructure. It's not about where should we have the charge station. It's about saying, do we really want to use that space for more cars? Or do we want to move it over to the open green spaces? The last insight I have many more, but today I'm only having 5. I'm saving you for too many insights here. Well, one thing that is important going back to this, whether it's temporary or permanent, I would say that one thing we can say for sure is that all of the things that are happening now would have happened anyway, more or less. There are some things that have been pushed like to 10 years ahead. I think it's like, are we ready for all of these changes? I'm not sure we are. But I think the tendencies we see also with the city center being a bit more empty is something that was on its way because we also had online shopping coming. I mean, we're heading for 30% of online shopping in just some years, so 2030. So like 10 years from now. But we're already like on 23, I think it is. So we have like already a tendency going, and this has been pushed forward. And I mean, in Copenhagen and Aarhus, we actually have a huge vacancy. And that's only when we talk about Aarhus, Copenhagen, and Danish cities. Smaller city has actually, like of the few shops they have, they are starting to close down too. If you look at New York and you look at the bigger cities, it's very critical how the vacancy is just increasing really much. And again, the dynamic of a city center is just going down. So going back to this kind of like, is that a resilient city center? So I think when coming to this with e-commerce, I think what we have seen very much and what is actually happening very much is that new delivery services are very interesting to talk about in this regards. Like, how do you actually make room for these kind of switch of things, or like change of things? Like, how can you actually start to make room for this in the city center? So e-commerce, like, even though you still order something online, you need to have it delivered somehow. So if you start to think about this, maybe there could be something in saving the last mile of delivery by using city center hubs for deliverance, so people actually could go there and you could create something around that. It could be very interesting to think about these kind of aspects in order to actually do it also, as some private stakeholders would say, to get some finance out of it, because I think this is also one of the challenge. It's not public building all of it. It's real estate owner that of course need to have a profit. They need to rent out buildings. So I think in this regard, I think it's super important to think about, well, people are not going to stop shop. People are not going to, it has decreased, and that's probably, if you ask someone, a good thing, but people are still doing things and ordering things. So I think looking at this, I think could be really, really interesting. So this is also a way of doing the tenancy. So again, maybe we can also learn from the local neighborhoods. And I'm not sure where you all live, but I'm sure that you all have some great places in where you live and around you, where you could ask yourself, why don't we have anything like that in the city center? Is that because we think the city center is for tourists and the local neighborhood is for locals? Or how can we rediscover what is the valuable part of the local area and move it to the high streets? Like, could there be some kind of exchange in that? Or, yeah, I think there will be many people saying we don't need a tourist in the local neighborhood, so I'm not suggesting to swap it. But I think there's still some kind of change of mindset needed when coming to like distributing activities and spreading activities over the city, and also to make sure that people are being spread. So we don't need like an empty city center and really full local neighborhoods. We need it to be balanced. So how do we get to this in order to make it more resilient?
Thanks very much to our presenters of this afternoon, and thanks also to you, and also sorry again for the technical problems we experienced. But that was our presentation and conference on pandemic resilient cities for the day. Thank you very much.